Hey guys, before tonight's journey begins, take a moment to settle in. Find the position your body wants to rest in. Loosen anything that feels tight. Let your shoulders drop, and let the day you have carried begin to set itself down. Tonight we are following a Victorian Englishwoman through the slow, quiet days of a winter spent in a log cabin in the Rocky Mountains, from the last warmth of autumn to the deep silence of the snow. There is nothing here you need to follow closely. The story moves at the pace of breathing, and it is meant to carry you gently towards sleep. If these quiet journeys help you rest, you are warmly welcome to follow the channel so that another evening like this one can find you when you need it. A quiet like, or a few words left below about where you're listening from tonight, helps others discover these stories too. There is no hurry to do any of it. It can wait until morning, or it can wait forever. None of it asks anything of you now. For now there is only this, the warmth around you, the slow settling of the night, a long gentle story waiting to begin. So let your eyes close if they wish to. Let your breathing slow, and when you are ready, we will step through a low doorway into a cabin that smells of pine smoke and cold air. The year is 1873, and the place is a valley so deep inside the Rocky Mountains that you could ride for days before reaching the nearest town. They call it Estes Park, though it's nothing like a park in the way you or I would use the word. It's a hollow in the mountains, 7,500 feet up, ringed by peaks that go much higher still, their granite faces split and scarred and patched with snow that never melts. Pines cover every slope, dark and thick, and at the southern end of the valley one mountain stands above all the others, Long's Peak, nearly 15,000 feet, its splintered summit the last thing the sunset touches, and the first thing the dawn turns red. In this valley, there is a cluster of log cabins. The largest is about 16 feet square, with a rough stone chimney and a floor of bare planks. The chinks between the logs were never properly filled, and in winter the fine snow drives through them like dust. Near it, down by the lake, there is a smaller cabin, rougher still with a door that won't shut and a window so small you could cover it with your two hands. This is where she sleeps. Her name is Isabella Bird. She's 42 years old, English, alone, and she has been travelling for months, by train across the plains, by horse through the canyons, by instinct and stubbornness through places most men wouldn't go without a rifle and a guide. She is not a young adventurer, she's not wealthy. By the time winter closes around this valley, she owns exactly one change of clothes, one handkerchief, and one pair of stockings so thoroughly darned that hardly any of the original wool is left. She uses the inside of her watch case as a mirror, and yet she stays. She stays through the first frost, through the snowstorms, through nights when the temperature drops so far below zero that her hair freezes into solid braids and the water bucket turns to a block of ice before morning. She stays while the supplies run low and the last of the sugar is used up, and the flour sinks toward the bottom of the sack. She cooks, she cleans, she chops wood, she rides out after cattle in the bitter wind, and in the evenings she sits by the fire mending the same riding dress she's been wearing for 3 months, while someone plays hymns on a small organ, and the wolves call from the ridge above the lake. I keep thinking about what it would have been like, not the cold, though the cold was real, and savage, but the slowness, the way each day repeated itself with only the smallest variations, the light a little different on the peaks, the ice a little thicker on the stream, one fewer cup of coffee in the tin, how the world outside that valley simply ceased to exist for weeks at a time. No letters, no news, no sound but the wind and the river and the crack of pine logs in the fire. There's something in that kind of quiet, something most of us have never experienced and probably never will. Tonight we'll go there. We'll stand beside her in that cabin, in that impossible valley, and watch how a woman with almost nothing made a life that held almost everything she needed. The fire is already lit, the pine smoke is rising, and the mountains are turning that particular shade of blue that means the sun has just gone down. If you'd been riding through the Rocky Mountains in the autumn of 1873, heading west and then north through one canyon after another, climbing higher with every mile, you'd have started to wonder whether there was anything at the end of the trail at all. The pines would have grown thicker around you, the air would have gotten thinner, colder, sharper in your lungs. The streams you crossed would have been edged with ice, and the only sounds would have been hooves on stone and the far-off crack of dead timber falling somewhere in the forest. For hours there'd be nothing but trees and rock, and the feeling that the mountains were closing in around you, tightening like the walls of a corridor that has no end. And then, after climbing through a narrow gap between two great slabs of granite, a gate, really, though no one built it, the mountains would have opened up, the trees would have pulled back, the sky would have widened, and below you, spread out in the late afternoon light, a valley would have appeared, meadows and glades, and a bright river winding through them, with dark pine forests rising on every side, and beyond the forests, the white teeth of the high peaks biting into a sky so deeply blue it looked almost violet. They called it Estes Park, and the word park in Colorado didn't mean what it means now. It meant a high, grassy hollow cradled by mountains, a place where the land levels out just enough for grass to grow and water to gather before the rock takes over again. This particular park sat at 7,500 feet, a broad sweep of meadow and glade threaded by a bright, fast-moving river called the Big Thompson, snowbound somewhere on the upper slopes of the range. The park was roughly 18 miles long and narrow, rarely wider than a couple of miles at any point, and its shape was all lawns and slopes and surprising little bays of grass opening between the pines. Pine forest darkened every mountainside, climbing in dense black-green masses until the trees gave out and bare granite took their place. And at the far southern end, rising above everything else in the valley, above every ridge and every lesser peak, stood Long's Peak, 14,700 feet, its summit splintered and pale, patched with snow that never melted. On clear evenings, it held the last of the sunset light for a full hour after every other mountain had gone dark. Isabella Bird rode into this valley on a borrowed horse, her luggage strapped behind the saddle, her clothes already worn past what most people would consider decent. She'd been travelling alone through the American West for weeks by then, by train across the plains, by stagecoach through the dusty settlements, by horse through canyons where the trail was sometimes nothing more than a suggestion. And she was not an obvious candidate for frontier life. She was 42, English, the daughter of a clergyman, and she had a spinal condition that made sitting in an ordinary chair painful for any length of time. But on horseback, for reasons no doctor could fully explain, she felt fine. Better than fine. The thin, dry air of the mountains, which made some people dizzy and short of breath, seemed to fill her with a steadiness and an energy she couldn't find anywhere else in the world. She'd tried other climates, the Sandwich Islands, Australia, New Zealand, but nothing matched this one. Nothing came close. You know what gets me about her arrival? She wasn't looking for adventure, not exactly. She was looking for a place that would let her breathe, and this valley, walled in by mountains on every side, with no road in or out except that narrow rocky trail, with the nearest settlement 30 miles away on the plains below. This valley was it. She knew it the moment she saw it. The ranch she'd come to find belonged to a Welshman named Henry Ashmore. He was the first white settler in the park, a short, sturdy man with a broad face and a laugh you could hear from one end of the valley to the other. He'd come out to Colorado years earlier from the slate quarries of North Wales with ruined lungs, expecting to live out whatever time he had left, and the mountain air had cured him so thoroughly that he'd stayed, built cabins, brought in cattle, and turned himself into a kind of frontier innkeeper. Travellers who found their way up to the park could board with him for $8 a week, which included meals, a bed, and free use of any horse on the ranch, if one could be found and caught, which was never a certainty. He was a generous man, reckless with money, fond of whiskey, a splendid hunter and a surprisingly good cook, and he was genuinely happy to see anyone who rode in out of the mountains. His cheery voice was the first thing you heard in the morning, often accompanied by a thump on your door and an invitation to ride out after cattle, and it was usually the last voice you heard before sleep. When he was away, which happened more than anyone liked, the whole valley felt quieter and somehow less sure of itself. Ashmore had a partner, a man named Charles Hewitt, who was his exact opposite. Tall, thin, grave, a teetotaler, disapproving of everything Ashmore spent and everything Ashmore drank, and as naturally unpopular as Ashmore was naturally beloved. Between them, they ran about 1,000 head of cattle, half-wild Texan animals that roamed the canyons and the upper meadows and had to be rounded up periodically, a task that required hard riding and a fair amount of nerve. They also had 50 horses, a few milk cows, some chickens, and a collection of buildings that had grown up around the main cabin as the need arose. A small dairy built of logs with a wooden wheel turned by the stream for churning butter, a corral of stout post and rail fencing for the horses, a shed for the lumber wagon, shelters for the weakest calves in winter, and a small room for whatever hired man happened to be working there at the time. The dairy sat on the stream below the house, and you could hear the soft knock of its water wheel from the porch if the wind was right. At 7,500 feet, all these things were necessities, not luxuries. The winters were long. The nearest settlement was a full day's ride away on the plains below, and everything that couldn't be hunted, grown, or made on the spot had to be hauled up by wagon over a trail so rough that the remains of other people's wagons, smashed and abandoned in the gulches, marked the route like warnings. The main cabin was about 16 feet square, built of heavy-hewn logs with a rough stone chimney at one end. Pine logs burned in that chimney day and night, and the resinous smell of them filled every room and hung in your clothes and your hair long after you'd stepped outside. The floor was bare planks, worn smooth by boots. The walls were decorated in the way of frontier homes. Antlers, animal skins, a bow and a set of arrows traded from the ute, and rifles standing in the corners. There was a round wooden table, a couple of rocking chairs, and a couch covered in hides where a sick man or a tired hunter could stretch out. Off one end was a tiny kitchen with an American cooking stove, and off the other a small bedroom, and that was the whole of it. The gaps between the logs should have been plastered shut with daub, but they never had been, not properly, and when the wind blew you could feel it moving through the room like a slow, cold breath. In winter, fine snow would drive through those gaps and settle on the floor like white dust, and sweeping it out became a kind of daily chore that no one minded because it was also, in its way, a kind of amusement. But Isabella didn't sleep in the main cabin. Ashmore showed her to a place of her own, 2 minutes' walk away, down by the lake. I want you to picture this because it matters. It was where she'd spend most of her hours alone over the months to come, and in a way it was the truest home she had during all her years of travelling. It was a very small, very rough log cabin. One room opened into another, and that was all. The first room had a stone chimney, and nothing else. The second had a bed made of hay, a wooden chair that held a small washing basin, a narrow shelf nailed to the log wall and a row of pegs for hanging clothes. A small window, really just a gap fitted with poor glass, looked out over the lake. Neither door had a lock. Neither door, in fact, would properly close because the wood had swelled with the season. The roof was bark and hay and mud, and it leaked when the weather turned. There was no lamp, no candle, no mirror, no curtain. That was her home for the next 3 months, and she accepted it as simply as if someone had handed her a key to a house on a London square. I keep coming back to that window. It faced the lake, and through it, from her haybed, Isabella could watch the dawn come in. She described this, and you can tell from the way she put it down that it wasn't a small thing to her. It was the centre of each morning. The lake would lie still in the dark before sunrise, a flat, heavy colour she called purple-grey. Then, all at once, the peaks would appear in its surface, inverted, trembling slightly, each one catching the first light before the real mountains above them did. The reflection came first, and then, slowly, the colour would spread. Rose, then gold, then that particular sharp blue that meant the day had truly begun, and the frost on the grass outside would catch the light and turn the meadow into something that glittered. She called it the Daily Miracle. And for a woman sleeping on hay in a cabin without a lock, with the wind coming through the walls and a wild animal living under the floorboards, that sunrise through a crooked little window was, I think, no small part of why she stayed. Because there was a creature under her floor. Her first night in that cabin, she was woken by a heavy rhythmic sound beneath her, a scraping and pushing, something large moving around directly below where she lay. She couldn't light a candle because she had none, so she lay still in the dark, listening, while whatever it was went on grunting and shuffling for the better part of an hour. In the morning, when she told the others, Ashmore laughed, that big carrying laugh of his, and said it was a skunk. It had a den under her cabin, and they didn't dare try to drive it out because a disturbed skunk could make the whole place unlivable for days. The smell of one, she was told, could travel a mile. Dogs that got too close would rub their noses raw against the ground trying to get rid of it, and clothes touched by the spray had to be thrown away entirely. So the arrangement was simply accepted. She would sleep above, the skunk would sleep below, and most nights they left each other in peace, though the scraping and the shuffling never entirely stopped, and she never entirely got used to it. There's something I find quietly wonderful about that. A Victorian clergyman's daughter and a skunk sharing a cabin in the Rockies, each pretending the other isn't there. It's the kind of detail that no one would invent. It's too strange and too ordinary at the same time, and it tells you something about the terms on which Isabella lived in this place, not as a conqueror or an explorer, but as a guest of the valley, a guest of the weather, and apparently a guest of whatever animal had claimed the space before her. Outside her door, the valley stretched in every direction, and the scale of it took some adjusting too. She'd come from England, where a walk of 5 miles might take you through 3 villages, past a church, along a hedgerow, and into a market town. Here, 5 miles in any direction brought you nothing but more pines, more rock, more sky. The big Thompson wound through the meadows catching light, vanishing into dark canyons, reappearing where you didn't expect it. Elk moved through the trees in the early mornings, huge animals with wide branching antlers, stepping carefully and unhurried, as if the valley belonged to them and they were merely tolerating the few humans who'd wandered in. Deer grazed on the slopes above the lake. Eagles turned slow circles against the blue. Crested blue jays stepped daintily across the frosted grass at dawn, picking at seeds, their feathers impossibly bright against the white. And at night the valley changed. Wolves called from the high ridges, their voices carrying far in the thin air. Owls hooted from the pines with a hollow, deliberate patience. And somewhere out in the dark, most nights, a mountain lion would let out a cry that sounded, people said, like a woman screaming, though Isabella never saw the creature, only heard it, and that was enough, and over everything, at every hour, long's peak. It dominated the valley the way a cathedral dominates a town square, not just by size, but by presence. It caught the first sun and the last. It generated the storms. Lightning played around its summit like something electrical and alive, and the winds that barely stirred the pine needles down in the park were raging up there, tearing at the bare rock. On clear mornings it stood sharp and pale against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and on cloudy days it vanished entirely, as if it had never been there, leaving only a grey blankness where a mountain should have been. Isabella came to think of it not as a landscape feature, but as a kind of companion. Distant, enormous, unpredictable. She watched it the way you'd watch a person whose moods you were trying to read, with respect and a little wariness, and something that was not quite fear but not quite comfort either. The valley sat at 7,500 feet above the sea. At that altitude, frost came every night of the year, even in midsummer. The air was so dry that meat could hang for months without spoiling, and so thin that breathing felt different. Not laboured exactly, but lighter, as though each breath went further than it should. The sky was enormous. On still nights the stars seemed close enough to hear, and the pole star, directly opposite the door of Isabella's cabin, burned with a steadiness that she said was like a lamp someone had left on for her. The silence was not the silence of an empty room. It was a deep, living silence, the kind that has weight to it, that presses gently against your ears and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Every sound within it, the snap of a twig, the murmur of the river, the distant crack of an icebound branch giving way, arrived clear and separate, as if the air itself were holding each one up for you to notice before letting it go. She settled in. She unpacked her small bag, hung her few things on the pegs, and began learning the rhythms of a place that had almost no rhythms at all. Only the slow turn of light on the mountains, the cold that came with the dark, the fire that had to be fed, and the long, quiet hours in between. The first frost of a Rocky Mountain autumn is not a gentle thing. It comes fast and sharp, and by morning everything, every blade of grass, every pine needle, every strand of cobweb stretched between the fence posts, is sheathed in white. But by mid-morning the sun is hot and the frost is gone, and the air is warm and dry and so clear that mountains 40 miles away look close enough to ride to before lunch. That was the world Isabella walked into, a world of extremes that somehow, between the freezing and the burning, found its own rough balance, a world that asked nothing of her except that she be there and that she pay attention. She was there, and the winter was coming. Imagine for a moment that you had to list every single thing you owned, not what's in your house, but what you could carry, what you could strap behind a saddle and ride with for 600 miles. For Isabella Bird in the autumn of 1873, that list would not have taken long to write. She had a carpet bag. Inside the carpet bag was one change of clothes, already well worn before she ever reached Colorado. She had a flannel riding suit, the thing she called her Hawaiian riding dress, which consisted of a half-fitted jacket, a skirt that fell to her ankles, and a pair of wide gathered trousers in the Turkish style, bloused and falling in frills over the tops of her boots. It was practical. It was modest enough for a woman riding alone through the frontier, and by the time she reached Estes Park it was nearly transparent with use. The fabric had thinned to almost nothing at the elbows and the seat. One seam or another gave way almost daily, and part of every evening without fail was given over to mending it by firelight. She had one handkerchief. She had one pair of stockings, darned so many times that the original wool had almost entirely disappeared beneath the patchwork of repair. You'd have to look closely to find any thread that dated from the day she bought them. She had a pair of worn-out boots, a dust cloak, a black silk dress she almost never wore, and an old umbrella whose cover she'd folded and tied over her hat as a sunshade on the ride-in. That was everything. That was a Victorian Englishwoman's complete estate in the Rocky Mountains. She mended that riding dress almost every evening by firelight, and it became a kind of meditation, the needle going in and out, the thread pulling tight, the fabric holding together for one more day. The elbows were the worst. They thinned first because she rested them on saddle horns and table edges and the rough logs of the cabin walls, and by late autumn she could see the outline of her arm through the cloth if she held it up to the light. The knees followed. Then the seat, which took the most punishment from the long hours in the saddle. She'd cut strips from less visible parts of the garment, a hem, an inner seam, to patch the places that showed, and the result was a dress that bore almost no resemblance to the one she'd started with. It was more patch than original, more repair than design, and yet it held. It did what it needed to do, which was to cover her body and keep the wind off her skin, and allow her to sit a horse without impropriety. And here's the part that stays with me. She didn't seem to mind. Not in the way of someone gritting their teeth and enduring, and not in the theatrical way of someone performing simplicity for an audience. She genuinely found, in that stripped-down life, a kind of freedom that surprised her. She wrote about it almost wonderingly, as if she were discovering something she hadn't expected. This rough little cabin, she felt, gave her everything she actually required. No tyranny of things, no elaborate and uselessly conventional life. 5 minutes to tidy her room each morning and the rest of the day belonged to her. I think about that sometimes. How much of what we own exists not because we need it, but because we're afraid of what it would feel like to go without it. Isabella went without nearly everything, and what she found on the other side of that was not deprivation. It was lightness. But then she'd earned that lightness by coming a very long way to reach it, and perhaps it only works if the mountains are big enough, and the air is thin enough, and the stars are close enough overhead. She had no mirror, so she used the polished inside of her watch case. You'd flip the case open, and there, in the curved silver surface, your face would appear. Small, distorted slightly by the curve, but recognizable. It was enough to check that your hair was pinned and your face was clean, and beyond that, what did it matter? There was no one to dress for, no society to impress, no drawing room to enter. The men she lived among wore boots that didn't match, one high, one low, whichever pair could be found in the morning, and shirts repaired with whatever thread was at hand, and if she'd arrived in silk and diamonds, they'd have treated her with exactly the same casual, slightly puzzled respect they showed her now. She washed her own clothes every day because she had so few that something always needed cleaning. She'd draw a bucket of water from the lake in the early morning, icy, so cold it made your fingers ache, and scrub whatever needed scrubbing and hang it on a line between two pines. One morning a calf wandered over and sucked one of her garments into hopeless rags before she could chase it away, which reduced her already desperate wardrobe by another piece. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for laundry day. Every stocking, every undergarment, every scrap of cloth cycled through the wash and back onto her body within 24 hours, and the process of keeping herself and her few things clean in a cabin with no running water, no washboard, and no soap that she didn't improvise became one of the quiet, absorbing labours of her days. After dark, if she wanted light, she had to make it. The cabin had no lamp and no candle, and for the first few days she simply went to bed when the sun went down, wrapped in blankets on the floor with the night sounds pressing in around her. But she was a resourceful woman, and before long she'd worked out a solution, a scrap of rag twisted into a wick and set in a tin of melted fat. It gave a small, unsteady yellowish flame that guttered in the draughts and threw wavering shadows across the log walls, but it was enough to see by, enough to read a few pages of the only book she'd brought, a copy of Thomas à Kempis, or to thread a needle and work on the endless mending. The family at the neighbouring cabin, she noticed, was so impressed by this improvisation that they began staying up past dark themselves, something they hadn't bothered to do before. Pine knots worked too if you could find good dry ones. They burned with a fierce, resinous light and a smell that was half campfire and half church incense, and they crackled and spat tiny sparks that you had to watch carefully near the hay bedding. What I find remarkable is how quickly the strangeness of it wore off and became routine. Within a week she'd stopped thinking of her life in the cabin as unusual. She rose early, before anyone else was stirring, when the light was still grey and the air inside the cabin was so cold she could see her breath. She'd fold the blankets, sweep the floor, which took about 5 minutes as the room was tiny, and then step outside into whatever the morning had brought. Some mornings the meadow was silver with frost, and her boots crunched through it, and left dark prints on the white grass behind her. Some mornings the mist sat in the valley like a shallow lake, filling the lower ground and leaving the treetops and the mountain ridges floating above it as if they'd come loose from the earth. She'd draw a bucket of water from the lake, and the cold of it was almost violent, the kind of cold that seizes your fingers and makes them go white and clumsy within seconds. She'd wash her face quickly, briskly, and head to the main cabin for breakfast. Breakfast was at 7, beef, potatoes, fresh bread, tea, coffee, and 2 pitchers of cream that were refilled as fast as anyone could empty them. The bread was very good. The beef was from a steer that hung in the shed outside, and they simply hacked off whatever piece came next, without much attention to cuts or joints. In that dry, thin air the meat didn't spoil. The outside turned black and hard, almost leathery, but the inside stayed sweet for months. Dinner at noon was the same as breakfast, but with the coffee left out and a large pudding added. Tea at 6 was the same as breakfast again. There was no variation. The same food, the same plates, the same benches, the same rough table day after day. And yet Isabella ate ravenously. They all did. The altitude and the cold and the physical labour of the day made every meal feel like a feast, and Ashmore's standing instruction was simply to eat as much as you could whenever you were hungry, because the kitchen was always open and there was always bread and milk. She had a horse too, a small bay Indian pony she'd been given for the season, a mare she called Wren. And if you want to understand something important about Isabella's life in that valley, you need to understand this horse. Wren was not a beautiful animal by any conventional standard. She was short-legged, compact, bred from wild stock with a coat that thickened into rough fur as the cold deepened, and a mane that hung long and tangled no matter how carefully you combed it. But she was extraordinary in every way that mattered. Her legs were hard as stone. She never stumbled, not on loose rock, not on ice, not on the steep root-tangled trails that wound through the canyons. She had a sure, quick intelligence. She'd stop and sniff a bridge before crossing it, and if she refused to go forward, you learned quickly that she was right and the bridge was unsafe. She could go all day on almost nothing and still have energy to spare. She had one trick. When the saddle went on in the morning, she'd puff herself up, take a deep breath and hold it, swelling her belly so the girth seemed tight enough. Isabella knew this game. A light pat on her flank, or any small surprise that made her exhale, and the girth would suddenly be 3 inches too loose and need tightening. It was a battle they fought every morning, and it always ended the same way. Isabella winning, Wren accepting defeat with a look that suggested she was only humouring her, and she followed Isabella everywhere, like a dog. If Isabella dismounted and walked ahead, the pony would trot along behind her with her nose against Isabella's shoulder, nuzzling her neck, begging for sugar in a soft, blarneying way that made everyone at the ranch laugh. The men at the stables called her Pet, and made a fuss of her whenever she came in. Every evening, before anything else, Isabella would tend to Wren, unsaddling her, sponging her nostrils, checking her feet, making sure she was fed and watered. It was always the first thing she did when she got back from a ride, before her own supper, before her own rest. The men at the stables noticed this and respected it. In the frontier West, how you treated your horse told people everything they needed to know about you. There's something about the bond between a person and a horse in a landscape like that. Something you wouldn't feel the same way in a stable yard in Surrey or a riding school in London. Out there, with 30 miles of mountain trail between you and the nearest town, your horse isn't a hobby or a sport. Your horse is the difference between getting home and not getting home, between reaching shelter before the storm hits and spending the night in the open at 20 below zero. Isabella understood this instinctively, and Wren seemed to understand it too. They looked after each other, and when the valley was at its loneliest and the wind was driving snow against the cabin walls, having a warm, living creature who recognised your step and came trotting toward you across the frozen meadow, that was worth more than any mirror or any silk dress or any other possession she might have carried up the mountain. The evenings in the main cabin had a rhythm of their own. After supper, the company would gather around the stone chimney, and the pine logs would be built up until the fire was roaring and the resin ran in bright streams down the bark. The room would fill with smoke from a dozen pipes. Nearly everyone smoked, men and women both, though Isabella didn't, and the conversation would settle into its familiar grooves. What they talked about, night after night, was always more or less the same, and yet never boring, because in a world that small every detail mattered. Had anyone seen the elk herd? How thick was the ice on the upper Beaver Dam? Were there fresh tracks on the ridge, bear or mountain lion? Had the last aurora been green or red, and what did that mean for the weather? Was there any chance someone might ride down to the plains and bring back letters? And always, underneath everything else, the quiet, shared awareness that winter was tightening its grip a little more each day, and that before long the trail out would be impassable, and they'd be alone in the valley with whatever they had, which was, by most standards, not very much at all. Some evenings there was music. Ashmore had a small cabinet organ, a harmonium, that someone had hauled up the mountain trail by wagon, and when the right person was visiting it would be played for hours, everything from hymns to dance tunes to funeral marches tumbling out of its bellows, driven reeds while the fire popped and the wind moaned in the chimney. Other evenings were quieter. Someone might read aloud from the few books that circulated through the cabin, worn copies of novels, a volume or two of travels, nothing recent, nothing from the world they'd left behind. Card games went on in the corner, low-voiced and unhurried. The hunters cleaned their rifles with a slow, absorbed attention, as if the act itself were a form of rest. Isabella would sit near the fire with her mending in her lap, listening and stitching in the unsteady light. The needle went in. The thread pulled tight. The wind pushed against the walls and found the cracks, and the music and the warmth and the low voices around her made a kind of shelter within a shelter, a small circle of human comfort in the middle of an enormous, indifferent wilderness. Politeness held, always. That surprised her. She'd expected roughness from frontier men, coarse speech, crude manners, the casual disregard for women that she'd been warned about in the eastern cities. But what she found was different. The men were quiet, considerate, and unfailingly courteous in a way that had nothing to do with drawing rooms or etiquette books. They simply respected her. They offered her things before taking them themselves. They didn't swear in her presence. They didn't let her carry wood or water if they could do it first, and all of this was done without fuss, without self-consciousness, as naturally as breathing. It was, she thought, a better kind of manners than any she'd known in England. Manners that came from character rather than convention. She once wrote that this life, washing, sweeping, baking, riding, mending, was a life in which nothing happened. But I don't think she believed that, not really. Too much was happening. It just wasn't the kind of happening that makes it into headlines or history books. It was the slow kind. The kind that works on you the way weather works on stone. So gradually that you don't notice it until one day you look up and realise you've been changed. The nights were the hardest, and the most beautiful. She'd cross the frosted grass from the main cabin to her own, carrying a heated stone or a piece of hot granite wrapped in cloth to warm the bed. The sky overhead would be savage with stars. The cold would bite through her thin clothes immediately, and by the time she reached her door, her fingers would be clumsy, and her breath would hang in the air in white clouds. She'd pile blankets on the floor, pull them up over her head, and listen to the skunk stirring beneath her, and the wind in the pines, and the distant mournful conversation of the wolves on the ridge. And somewhere in the middle of all that cold and darkness and strangeness, she'd fall asleep. It was enough. She had almost nothing, and it was enough. The stove was the heart of everything, not the fireplace. That was for warmth and for company, for the long evenings when people gathered around it and stared into the flames and talked or didn't talk. The stove was different. The stove was work. It was a big, black, cast-iron American cooking stove that squatted in the tiny kitchen like something alive, and it demanded constant attention. You had to feed it wood, split pine, cut to the right length, dry enough to catch but not so dry that it burned too fast. And you had to feed it often, because the firebox was small, and the appetite of that iron beast was bottomless. If you let the fire die down for 20 minutes, the oven temperature dropped, and whatever you were baking went flat or raw in the middle. If you overfed it, the stovetop got so hot that grease spat and milk scorched, and the tin kettle handle burned your hand through a cloth. Learning to manage that stove was like learning to manage a difficult horse. You had to develop a feel for it, an instinct for when to add a stick and when to let it be, and it took weeks before the rhythm became natural. Isabella had never really cooked before she came to Estes Park. That's worth pausing over, because it tells you something about the world she came from. In England in the 1870s, a woman of her class, the daughter of a clergyman, educated, travelled, would not have cooked her own meals. There would have been a kitchen, and in the kitchen there would have been a cook, and between the cook and the dining table there would have been a clear and uncrossable line. Isabella would have known how to plan a menu, how to instruct a servant, how to judge whether a roast was properly done when it arrived at the table. But the actual labour of it, the kneading, the frying, the management of heat and timing, would have been as foreign to her as shoeing a horse. And yet here she was, in a kitchen the size of a large cupboard, with a stove she barely understood, and a set of equipment that would have made any cook in London weep. Everything they had fit on a single shelf. There was the stove, there was a kettle, there was a frying pan heavy and black with years of use. There was a large brass pan that held 6 gallons, good for boiling anything that needed boiling. Potatoes, water for washing, occasionally a pudding wrapped in cloth, and there was a glass bottle, which served as a rolling pin. That was all. No whisk, no proper baking tins, no measuring cups, no thermometer. You judged the oven by holding your hand inside it and counting. You measured flour by the handful. You tested bread by tapping the bottom of the loaf and listening for a hollow sound, and if it didn't sound right, you put it back and hoped for the best. The bread was the most important thing. It was the foundation of every meal, and in a place where there was no baker and no shop and no way to get more flour until someone made the 30-mile ride down to the plains, the bread had to be good, and it had to last. When the Ashmore family was still at the ranch in autumn, it was the women who baked, Ashmore's wife and the wife of his partner, working in shifts it seemed, because the baking never stopped. Loaf after loaf came out of that iron oven, golden and crusty and dense, with a particular sweetness that the high altitude seemed to give the flour, and the smell of it, warm, yeasty, faintly smoky from the pine wood, was the smell of the cabin itself. You couldn't separate the two. The smell of that bread was home. But the women left before winter set in. Ashmore took his family down to the plains, where the children could go to school and his wife could escape the worst of the cold, and suddenly the question of who would make the bread became urgent and real. Isabella stepped into the gap, not because she was confident, but because someone had to. Her first attempts were, by her own quiet admission, not good. The altitude changed everything. Dough rose differently at 7,500 feet. Baking times shifted. The dry air pulled moisture out of the flour before you could work it. But she learned. She watched how Frederick Colville did it. He was the best cook among the men who stayed. A quiet, capable young man who seemed to know instinctively how long to knead and when to stop. He had a trick for getting the bread to rise without commercial yeast. He'd mix a bit of flour and water together and leave it near the warmth of the stove until it turned sour, and that sour starter, fed and tended like a small pet, would leaven the bread beautifully. Isabella had her own method. There was a churn in the dairy with a residue of thick old buttermilk at the bottom, weeks old and sharp smelling, and she found that a spoonful of this would raise a batch of rolls as well as any yeast she'd ever used. The rolls came out light and warm, and the men ate them as fast as she could make them. I keep thinking about that buttermilk, 6 weeks old, sitting in the bottom of a wooden churn in a log dairy in the Rocky Mountains, and it still worked. It still had enough life in it to make dough rise. There's something almost stubborn about that. A small, sour, living thing refusing to give up, doing its one job in the cold and the dark. I don't know why that detail moves me, but it does. She made other things too as her confidence grew. Sweet biscuits, 4 pounds at a time, using whatever sugar was left and a bit of the precious butter. Rolled puddings with molasses, the dough wrapped around the filling and boiled in a cloth in the big brass pan. A spiced ginger cake that weighed 4 pounds and disappeared almost before it cooled. But that's a story for later. She learned to fry venison steaks in the proper frontier way, searing them fast in a very hot pan so the outside crisped, while the inside stayed tender and pink. And she made custard, saving eggs and cream for days to have enough, beating them together with a fork because there was no whisk, and cooking the mixture slowly in a tin set inside a larger tin of hot water, watching it thicken with the anxious attention of someone who knows that if she looks away for 30 seconds, the whole thing will curdle and be ruined. The venison itself was a thing that took getting used to. Before winter brought the elk and the deer down from the higher ridges, the main meat was beef, that steer hanging in the shed, hacked at daily, its outer surface blackening in the cold, dry air while the inner flesh stayed sound. But beef ran out, or grew tiresome, and when the young men began hunting in earnest, the diet shifted to game. Elk meat is darker than beef, leaner, with a faintly wild taste that comes from the animal's diet of mountain grass and pine browse. Venison, the meat of the smaller deer, is finer grained, more delicate, and dries beautifully into strips that can be chewed slowly on a long ride or crumbled into a stew. The men would bring the carcass in on horseback, slung across the saddle, and hang it in the cold air outside the shed, and for days afterward the kitchen would smell of roasting game and hot fat and pine smoke, all of it mingling into something that was not refined but was deeply, thoroughly satisfying. And then there was trout. The streams around the valley were full of them, bright speckled cold water fish with crimson spots along their sides, quick and muscular from the fast current. When the men went fishing they came back with dozens, sometimes 40 pounds or more in a single outing, and on those evenings the kitchen became a place of real excitement. Colville had a method for frying trout that was simple and perfect. He'd keep the big iron pan on the stove with butter melting in it, not a thin film, but enough to cover the fish entirely, deep and hot and foaming. He'd roll each trout in coarse cornmeal until it was coated all over, then lower it into the bubbling butter. One turn, just one, and out it came. Golden on the outside, the flesh inside still white and flaking, the whole fish crackling and hissing on the plate. They'd eat them as fast as he could cook them, and on a good night the pan would be refilled 5 or 6 times, and even the hungriest person at the table, and there was always one who was hungrier than the rest, would finally lean back and say nothing more was needed. And there's something I want to say about that kind of cooking. The kind done not out of pleasure or artistry, but out of need. When you cook because there's nothing else to eat if you don't, when the nearest restaurant is a 30-mile ride through snow, and the nearest shop might as well be on the moon, cooking stops being a choice and becomes something more like breathing. You don't think about whether you feel like making bread today. You make bread today because without it there's nothing on the table but cold venison and black coffee. And in that necessity there's a kind of dignity, even a kind of peace. The questions that plague modern cooking: what should we have? What are we in the mood for? Is this recipe too complicated? Simply don't exist. You have flour, you have fat, you have salt, you have meat. You make what you can with what you have, and you eat it, and you're grateful, and you do it again tomorrow. The kitchen was a cramped and smoky place. barely big enough for two people to stand in without bumping elbows, and in winter, it was the warmest room in the cabin, which meant it was also the most crowded. The stove threw off heat in waves, and on the coldest mornings, when the temperature outside had dropped so far below zero that the mercury in the thermometer disappeared entirely, the kitchen was the only room where water stayed liquid and breath didn't hang in the air as white fog. People drifted in and out all day, warming their hands against the stovetop, refilling their coffee from the kettle that always sat at the back, checking on whatever was baking inside. The dogs came too, big, shaggy hunting dogs, pressing their bodies against the hot iron base of the stove and refusing to move no matter how many times they were pushed aside or stepped over. Sometimes a cat would settle on top of a dog's back, and the two of them would sleep there together in a warm, unlikely heap while the cooking went on around them. There were always dishes to wash, and they washed them in water heated on the stove, in a tin basin, with a rag and whatever grease-cutting substance could be improvised from the supplies at hand. Isabella washed dishes, she dried dishes, she peeled potatoes, she chopped wood for the stove and carried it in armloads from the pile outside. None of this was work she'd been trained for, and yet she did it with a kind of quiet competence that earned her the respect of the men around her, who were not easily impressed, and who judged people, men and women alike, not by what they said they could do, but by what they actually did. You know what I think she discovered in that kitchen? That there's a particular satisfaction in physical work that solves an immediate problem. You're cold, so you build a fire. You're hungry, so you make bread. The bread rises or it doesn't. The stove heats or it doesn't. There's no ambiguity, no committee, no second opinion needed. The feedback is instant and honest, and at the end of the day you can point to something real. A clean kitchen, a stack of fresh rolls, a pot of stew that will feed 4 people, and say, I did that. For a woman who'd spent most of her life in a world where accomplishment was abstract and approval was social, this must have been a revelation. The bread didn't care about her accent or her dress or her opinions on theology. It only cared whether she'd kneaded it long enough and kept the oven at the right heat. And when it came out right, when the crust cracked and the inside was soft and the smell filled the kitchen, that was an honest triumph, earned with her own hands, and no one could take it from her. The water was another daily labour, and in some ways the most thankless one. There was no tap, no pump, no well. Water came from the stream that ran out of the lake, and in autumn it was simply a matter of walking down with a bucket and dipping it in. But as winter closed in, the stream began to freeze. First a skin of ice along the edges, thin enough to crack with your boot heel, then thicker shelves that crept out from both banks, narrowing the open channel to a dark ribbon in the middle. Then, one morning, the whole surface would be solid, and you'd have to take an axe and chop a hole to reach the water underneath. The hole would freeze over again within hours, and the next time you needed water you'd chop it open again and again and again. It became one of the defining rhythms of winter, the steady, repetitive labour of keeping a hole open in the ice so that people and animals could drink. The sound of the axe striking ice carried clearly in the cold air, a sharp, ringing crack that echoed off the canyon walls and came back to you a moment later, softened and distant, like someone answering from very far away. The milk came from a single cow, a calico-coloured animal that had to be brought in from the meadow twice a day and coaxed into standing still long enough to be milked. In good weather this was a straightforward chore, but as the cold deepened and the cow grew reluctant to leave whatever sheltered spot she'd found, the process became an expedition in itself, trudging through snow to find her, leading her back through drifts, warming your fingers enough to grip and pull, and then carrying the heavy pail back to the kitchen without spilling it on the frozen ground. The cream that rose to the top of the milk was thick and yellow, rich from the mountain grasses, and it went into the coffee and onto the bread, and into whatever pudding or custard Isabella managed to put together. When the cow was eventually lost, wandered off to join the wild cattle in the upper canyons, they felt the absence sharply. Milk and cream had been the one luxury in a diet of plain repetition, and without them the meals became grimmer and more monotonous than they'd been before. But even at the leanest, even when the flour was low and the sugar was gone and the coffee was rationed to 1 cup a day, there was still the stove. It still burned. It still threw its dry, wood-scented heat into the little kitchen. And as long as there was fire and flour, there was bread. And as long as there was bread, the day had a shape. Morning. Light the stove, mix the dough, set it to rise. Midday, bake it, slice it, serve it. Evening, bank the fire, sweep the ash, set the starter for tomorrow. The stove asked nothing complicated. It only asked to be fed and tended and not forgotten. And in that slow rhythm, I think, there was something that Isabella needed very badly and hadn't known she was missing. A reason to get up. A task that mattered. A warm thing at the centre of a cold world asking only to be tended. A mountain storm doesn't creep up on you. It announces itself. Hours before the first flake falls, you can feel it in the air. A change in pressure, a tightening, as if the atmosphere itself were holding its breath. The sky over the peaks turns a colour that isn't quite grey and isn't quite purple, but something in between, a bruised and heavy colour that sinks lower and lower until the highest ridges disappear into it, and then the middle ridges disappear too, and all you can see from the cabin door is the nearest line of pines, and beyond them nothing. The wind changes direction. In fair weather, the wind in Estes Park came from the west, dry and sharp and clean. But before a storm, it swung to the northeast, and with it came a dampness that didn't belong at that altitude, a heaviness that pressed against your skin and made the cold feel different. Not the bright, bracing cold of a clear mountain day, but a dull, seeping cold that found its way into your joints and your lungs and settled there. The animals always knew first. The horses would come down from whatever high meadow they'd been grazing in, and stand close to the corral, facing away from the wind, their tails tucked between their legs. The cattle, hundreds of them, scattered through the canyons and the upper valleys, would begin moving in long single-file lines toward the open park, the bulls leading, the cows and calves following, all of them walking with the slow, deliberate purpose of creatures obeying an instinct older than thought. Even the birds changed. The crested jays, which normally hopped and squabbled around the cabin all day, would vanish into the deep pines and go silent. And then, for a little while, there'd be nothing. No wind, no sound, no movement. Just the sky pressing down and the mountains gone and the whole valley holding still, waiting. And then it would come. The first storm of that winter, the real one, the one that changed everything, came in late October. Isabella was alone in her lakeside cabin when it hit. She'd gone to bed with 6 blankets piled on top of her, and a heavy sheet pulled over her face against the cold, and for a while she slept. But sometime after midnight she was woken by a sound she'd never heard before. A deep, sustained roaring. Not like wind in the ordinary sense, but like something immense and solid moving through the air above the cabin. The roof was lifting. She could feel it, not see it, because the cabin was pitch dark, but feel the whole structure shuddering and straining upward, the bark and hay and mud of the roof cracking and separating, and through the widening gaps a fine, hard, needle-sharp snow was driving in with a hissing sound, like sand thrown against glass. She lay still. There was nothing else to do. The roaring went on, hour after hour, and underneath it came other sounds. The splitting of tree branches under the weight of the snow, the heavy crack of entire limbs breaking off and crashing down somewhere in the darkness, the strange groaning of tree trunks bending past their limit. Pine boughs that had held firm all autumn were snapping like dry bones, and each snap was followed by a muffled crash and then silence, and then the wind again. These sounds went on all around the cabin, close and far, for hours, and between them the wind would find a new gap in the logs and drive another stream of powdered ice across the floor. Once something large, a fox or a skunk she never knew, rushed in through the broken wall at the far side of the cabin, scrabbled frantically across the floor near her head, and threw itself out through the window gap. She felt the brush of fur against her cheek and lay rigid, her heart hammering, while the storm raged on indifferently above. She pulled the blankets over her head and tried to sleep, but the cold was beyond anything she'd experienced. The sheet that covered her face had frozen to her lips. She reached out a hand from under the blankets and found the bed, such as it was, thickly covered in fine, dry snow. The bucket of water she kept beside her was no longer water. It was a solid cylinder of ice. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Imagine lying in the dark, in a cabin whose roof is tearing itself apart above you, in a place so remote that if you screamed no one would hear you over the wind. The snow is falling on your bedsheet is frozen to your face, the water beside you has turned to stone, and outside, in every direction, there is nothing but mountains and forest, and a storm so violent that the air itself has become a weapon. You can't leave, you can't call for help. You can only lie there, under your blankets, and wait for morning, and hope that morning will be better. She waited. The mercury, she learned later, had dropped well below 0 during the night. How far below, no one could say exactly, because at some point it fell past the bottom of the thermometer and simply vanished. The gale lasted 10 hours. By dawn, if you could call it dawn, because the light that came was grey and weak and barely distinguishable from the darkness it replaced. The snow had drifted against her door so deeply that she couldn't push it open. She lay there in the dim half-light, frozen and stiff, her hair wet from the thawed and refrozen snow that had fallen on her pillow, her fingers so numb she could barely close them into a fist. She lay like that until some of the men from the main cabin came wading through the drifts to dig her out. They brought warm water in a tin, but it turned to ice before she could wash with it. She dressed standing in snow, actual snow, inches deep on the floor of her own room, and when she gathered her things, she found that her boots, her brushes, her clothes, everything she owned was buried under a layer of white. When she finally stepped outside, she couldn't see the mountains. She couldn't see anything. The snow on the windward side of the cabin had drifted higher than the roof, and the air, as high up as she could look, was a single, stinging, white blur. Not falling snow, not anymore. The storm had stopped dropping new snow, but the wind was picking up everything that had already fallen and driving it horizontally across the park in clouds, so thick and so fast that they looked like smoke. The whole valley was one white, furious swirl. It stung her face. It found the gaps in her clothing. It made breathing difficult because each gust carried with it a freight of tiny, sharp ice crystals that caught in the throat and burned. Inside the main cabin, things were not much better. Snow had driven through every crack and gap in the logs and lay in drifts across the floor. The living room, which had a fire burning all night, was still cold enough that breath hung visible in the air. Ashmore, who'd fallen sick before the storm, was lying in his bed under a blanket crusted with fine white powder. The stove in the kitchen was going, but beyond its immediate circle of warmth the world was frozen. The milk pail was a block of solid white. The molasses jar, that thick dark syrup that sweetened their bread and flavoured their puddings, had hardened into something you could tap with a spoon and it wouldn't give. The eggs had to sit on the least hot part of the stovetop just to prevent them from freezing solid, and even there they were sluggish and reluctant to crack. Outside, in the cattle shed, 2 young calves had frozen where they stood during the night. They were still upright when they were found, stiff and white-rimmed, as if they'd simply stopped in the middle of a thought and never started again. You know what strikes me about extreme cold? It's not dramatic, not in the way fire or flood or earthquake is dramatic. It doesn't roar or crash or shake the ground, it just stops things, quietly, completely. Water stops being liquid, air stops being comfortable, your fingers stop working, your thoughts slow down, the world narrows to the smallest possible circle, the stove, the blanket, the cup of something warm in your hands, and everything outside that circle becomes hostile territory. You don't fight the cold the way you'd fight a fire, you retreat from it. You gather what warmth you can into the tightest space you can manage, and you hold on, and you wait for it to pass. For 3 days they were snowed in. No one went out except to bring in firewood and shovel a path to the door. The men who were hunters, who normally spent their days ranging through the canyons with rifles, had nothing to do but sit by the fire and play cards and tell stories and wait. Chess was attempted. Music was played, though without much spirit. Isabella mended things. The cabin felt smaller than it was, with all of them pressed together in one room, and the dogs underfoot, and the constant scrape of shovels outside where someone was always trying to keep the snow from burying the entrance entirely. One of the men, Oliver Ashworth, who was the most delicate among them, kept Isabella's ink bottle warm by the fire, passing it to her each time she needed to dip her pen, because without that attention the ink froze in the bottle within minutes. It was a small kindness, and she noticed it and remembered it. The silence after the storm was enormous. When the wind finally dropped and the sky cleared, the world that appeared was not the world they'd known. It was a new place, white and smooth and utterly still, as if someone had taken a cloth and wiped away every feature, every landmark, every familiar shape. Where there had been fences, there were now long, smooth drifts. Where there had been paths, there was nothing. The stream was invisible, buried under ice and snow. The smaller cabins were half submerged, their roofs humped with white, their doors blocked, their windows blind. And the mountains, when the clouds finally lifted enough to show them, were transformed. Every peak was pure white, not just at the summit, but all the way down to the tree line, where the dark pines stood out against the snow like ink marks on clean paper. The higher ridges, where the wind still raged even after the valley had gone calm, trailed long plumes of snow from their crests, streaming out against the blue sky like banners. Long's Peak looked, Isabella wrote, as if it were on fire. Great clouds of white billowing up from its summit and its flanks, caught by the upper winds and drawn out across the sky in long glowing streamers that the sunlight turned to gold. There's something about a landscape after heavy snow that I don't think any other weather can produce. It's not just the beauty of it, though the beauty is real and almost painful. It's the silence. Snow absorbs sound the way a sponge absorbs water. It soaks up the small noises, footsteps, bird calls, the rustle of branches, and what's left is a quiet so deep it feels physical, as if the air itself has thickened. You become aware of sounds you'd never normally hear. The creak of a fence post expanding in the cold, the soft thump of snow sliding off a pine bough and landing in the drift below, the distant, almost subliminal murmur of water still moving under the ice of the stream. Everything is padded, muffled, gentled, and in that enormous hush, your own breathing sounds very loud and very close and very much alive. The cattle came down, not all at once, but in long, slow files that emerged from the canyons over the course of the day. 700 or 800 animals, walking nose to tail through the deep snow, the bulls in front as always, their broad heads low, their breath rising in white clouds. They came down because the snow in the upper valleys was too deep for them to reach the grass beneath it, and because some ancient instinct told them that where there were people there might be shelter and feed. They gathered in the open meadow near the cabins and stood there in the cold, patient and still, their backs dusted with white, their dark eyes watching the cabin doors. They didn't bellow or push or make a fuss, they just came and stood and waited. Isabella watched them from the window and found something deeply moving in that silent procession. All those animals, wild enough to spend their summers in the farthest canyons, walking calmly toward the only human settlement for miles, trusting that it would be enough. And here's the thing about a storm like that. Once it passes, once you've survived it, and dug yourself out and gotten warm again, everything looks different. Not just the landscape, though, that's changed completely. But the way you see the cabin, the stove, the fire, the people around you. Before the storm, these were ordinary things. A rough shelter, a primitive kitchen, a handful of acquaintances thrown together by circumstance. After the storm, they were everything. The cabin wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was the only warm place in a frozen world. The stove wasn't just a stove. It was the single, fragile source of heat between you and a cold that could stop your heart. The people around you weren't just companions. They were the only other human beings for 30 miles in every direction. And if something happened to you, if you fell through the ice, if you got lost in a drift, if you simply lay down in the cold and couldn't get up again, they were the only ones who'd come looking. Isabella never said this in so many words, but you can feel it in the way she wrote about the days after the storm. There's a tenderness that wasn't there before, a gratitude for small things, for the warmth of the fire, for the sound of a voice, for the sight of someone else's face across the table. The storm had stripped away whatever remained of the polite distance between them. They were past that now. They were people who'd been cold together, and afraid together, and who'd come out the other side, and that changes things. It changed them. The snow evaporated slowly in the days that followed. Not melting, the temperature was too low for that, but disappearing by a process the settlers called sublimation, the ice turning directly to vapour without ever becoming water. It happened fastest in the sun, and on the south-facing slopes you could actually watch the snow thinning, the grass beginning to show through in patches, the dark earth reappearing in streaks and circles like something rising to the surface of a frozen sea. The north-facing slopes stayed white for weeks. The deepest drifts in the sheltered hollows and the shaded canyons would be there until spring. But in the open park, where the sun hit full and the wind kept the ground scoured, the grass came back surprisingly fast, sun-cured and golden, still nutritious enough for the cattle to graze on through the coldest months. And the sky, after the storm, was the bluest Isabella had ever seen it. Not the pale, washed blue of an English winter, but a deep, saturated blue that looked almost dense, almost solid, as if you could reach up and touch it and your fingers would come away stained. The air was so clear that mountains she'd never noticed before, ranges 70, 80 miles away, stood sharp and distinct on the horizon, their white peaks glittering against that impossible blue. The stars at night were fierce. The frost was savage. and the beauty of it, the beauty of a world scrubbed clean and made new by violence, was the kind of beauty that doesn't comfort you. It humbles you. It makes you very small and very quiet and very glad to be standing in it at all. The fire in the cabin burned on, the stove still asked to be fed, and outside in the white and silent park the cattle stood in the meadow with their breath rising, waiting for nothing, patient as the mountains themselves. One by one, the valley emptied. The families went first. Ashmore took his wife and children down to the plains before the worst of the cold set in, packing them into the wagon with blankets and provisions for the long ride down the canyon. His partner, Charles Hewitt, followed with his own wife a few days later, his tall, disapproving figure climbing onto the wagon seat with the air of a man who had always suspected this venture would come to nothing, and was now being proved right. The hired men drifted away. The occasional travellers who'd been boarding at the ranch, hunters passing through, men with ruined lungs seeking the mountain cure, drifters working their way south ahead of winter. All of them packed up and rode out one by one until the cabin that had buzzed with a dozen voices and the clatter of boots on the porch fell quiet. And then there were three. Isabella Bird, 42, English, a clergyman's daughter travelling alone through the American West. Oliver Ashworth, young, English, well-read, well-spoken, and not well. He'd come to the mountains for his health, the way many young men did in those years, hoping the thin, dry air would do for his lungs what medicine had not. And Frederick Colville, also young, quieter than Ashworth, practical where Ashworth was bookish, with strong hands and a knack for making things work. Fires, bread, harnesses, anything mechanical or physical that needed doing. Two young men and a middle-aged woman, none of them related, none of them particularly close when the others were still around, now left entirely alone in a valley that could take a full day to ride across, and that had, as of that week, no other inhabitants at all. What would that be like? I've tried to imagine it. Not the cold, not the isolation, those are easy enough to picture in the abstract. But the social part, the part where you wake up every morning and the only two faces you'll see that day, and the next day, and the day after that, are the same two faces. Where every conversation you'll have for the next several weeks will be with the same two people, about the same few subjects, in the same small room, where there's no possibility of escape, no privacy to speak of, no way to take a walk and clear your head without trudging through snow for an hour and arriving back at the same cabin you left. That kind of closeness can break people apart. It can also, if the people are right, create something rare. They were, as it turned out, the right people. The division of labour happened naturally, without discussion, without anyone drawing up a list or assigning roles. Colville took over the cooking and the heavier outdoor work, splitting wood, hauling it in, managing the stove, tending the cattle that remained in the park. He was good at all of it. His bread was consistently excellent, and his manner in the kitchen was calm and unhurried, the manner of a man who genuinely enjoyed the work and wasn't doing it as a favour. Ashworth took on the water, chopping through the ice each morning with the axe, carrying the heavy buckets back, a task that would have been unremarkable for a healthy man but was quietly heroic for someone whose lungs were damaged and who struggled for breath in the thin air at any kind of exertion. He never complained. He never asked anyone else to do it. He simply went out each morning with the axe and the bucket and came back with the water and said nothing about how hard it was. Isabella noticed this. She noticed everything. Her own share was what she called the indoor work, sweeping the cabin, washing the milk pans and the dishes, cleaning the dairy, feeding and watering the horses. She also took over the mending for all three of them, which was considerable since everyone's clothes were in roughly the same state of advanced disrepair. The milk pans were heavy and cold, and in winter the water she washed them in had to be heated on the stove first, which meant the simple act of cleaning up after breakfast could take the better part of an hour. The dairy floor needed scrubbing. The cabin floor needed sweeping twice a day at least, because the fine snow that blew in through the gaps between the logs settled on everything and had to be cleared before it melted and soaked into the planks. She fed the horses sheaf oats from the dwindling supply in the barn, filling the troughs with numb fingers, talking to them as she worked, to Wren especially, who would press her warm nose against Isabella's cold cheek and nicker softly, as if to say she understood. In the evenings she'd sit by the fire with a pile of torn shirts and frayed stockings and work through them methodically, her needle catching the firelight, while the men smoked or read or simply sat in the silence that had become comfortable between them. And that's the thing I want to say about these three. The silence was comfortable. It wasn't strained. It wasn't the silence of people who have nothing to say to each other, or the silence of people who are angry, or the silence of people who are being polite because they have to be. It was the silence of people who've spent enough time together that talking has become optional. They could go for an hour without a word and no one felt awkward. They could sit at the table and eat their bread and venison and drink their coffee and exchange nothing more than a glance or a gesture. Pass the salt, more wood on the fire, and it was enough. Isabella described it as being like three men sharing a cabin, and she meant it as a compliment. The men treated her as an equal. They didn't fuss over her. They didn't defer to her or condescend to her, or treat her as fragile. They simply made room for her in the rhythms of the day, and she made room for them, and together they built something that worked. They lost track of time. That sounds like a small thing, but in a world without calendars or newspapers or mail or church bells or any of the 100 small signals that tell you where you are in the week, it became genuinely disorienting. Was it Wednesday? Thursday? Had a week passed, or 10 days? No one could say for certain. The sun rose and set, the fire was lit and banked, the bread was made and eaten, and the days blurred together into a single repeating pattern that had no external markers at all. Isabella tried to keep count in her letters, but even she got confused, and there were stretches where she wasn't sure within 2 or 3 days what the actual date was. It didn't matter, really. Out there, with the snow deep and the trail impassable, and no one coming or going, the days of the week were meaningless. Monday was the same as Saturday. There was no Sunday service, no market day, no post. There was just the next morning, and the one after that, and the fire that needed feeding, and the water that needed fetching, and the slow, quiet business of staying alive. I think about what they must have talked about, those three, during the long evenings by the fire. The source material gives hints, but not transcripts, so I'm guessing. But I think the guessing is fair. They would have talked about the weather, because in a place like that, the weather isn't small talk, it's survival intelligence. They would have talked about the animals, which horses were doing well, which ones were losing weight, whether the cattle had enough grass under the snow. They would have talked about the mountains, because you can't live inside a landscape that enormous and that beautiful without constantly remarking on it. The way the light changed, the way the clouds moved, whether that was snow on the north face of Long's Peak or just a shadow. And they would have talked, carefully and occasionally, about themselves, where they came from, what they'd left behind, what they hoped for, what they feared. Not all at once, not in confessional outpourings, just in fragments, offered and received, the way people share things when they have all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. Ashworth was the reader among them. He kept a few books in his trunk, poetry, novels, nothing that would weigh much. And on the coldest evenings, when going outside even for a minute felt like punishment, he'd read aloud by the fire. His voice was quiet and steady, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who's spent a lot of time alone with books, and has learned to hear the rhythm of a sentence the way a musician hears a phrase. Isabella liked listening to him. It reminded her, she wrote, of evenings in her father's rectory in England. The fire, the book, the voice. And the fact that this particular fire was in a log cabin in the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by snow and wolves and 800 miles of wilderness, made the echo sweeter and stranger and more precious. Colville was different. He didn't read much, and he didn't talk much. But when he did speak, it was always worth hearing. A dry observation, a practical suggestion, a piece of frontier wisdom delivered without emphasis or self-importance. He had a quality that's hard to describe but impossible to miss when you encounter it. Competence so deep it doesn't need to announce itself. He could split a pine log with 3 strokes of the axe while someone else was still positioning the wedge. He could look at the sky and tell you within the hour when the next snow was coming. He made bread the way some people play piano, with an ease that made it look simple and a result that proved it wasn't. Isabella trusted him completely, and he repaid that trust by never once letting her down. Then Edwin Price arrived, and the equilibrium shifted. Price was a theological student who'd been sent up from Longmount to work at the ranch in exchange for his board. This was a common arrangement on the frontier. Young men with no money but strong backs could earn their keep by doing the physical labour that the ranch required. The theory was sound. The problem was Price. He was, to put it charitably, not gifted at ranch work. He was not, in fact, gifted at very much. He was a pale, thin, earnest young man whose theology was considerably more developed than his practical skills. and within days of his arrival it became clear that he was going to be far more trouble than he was worth. His appetite, however, was extraordinary. Colville looked at him the first evening with an expression that Isabella described as doleful, and said simply that they now had another mouth to feed. Given that their supplies were already shrinking and the nearest store was a hard day's ride away in winter conditions, this was not a welcome development. Price ate. He ate with the focused, single-minded determination of a man who's been underfed for a long time, and intends to make up for it at every opportunity. He ate at meals. He ate between meals. He ate things that were being saved for specific purposes. The sugar set aside for baking, the dried fruit hoarded for a special occasion. He seemed unable to pass through the kitchen without taking something, and the supplies that the three of them had been carefully rationing began to vanish at an alarming rate. One night, and this became a kind of legend in the cabin, he got up in the dark and consumed half of a 4-pound cake that Isabella had baked the day before, using the last of their good ingredients. Half. 2 pounds of cake, eaten in silence, in the dark, while everyone else slept. When the loss was discovered in the morning, no one said anything directly. The frontier code of hospitality prevented open accusation, but the looks exchanged across the breakfast table were eloquent. The cake had been the last proper luxury they had, and it was gone. There's something almost comic about Price, and I think Isabella saw the comedy of him even as she was exasperated by him. He was sent out one morning to milk the cow and came back with an empty pail and a baffled expression. The cow, he reported, would not give milk. They went to look and discovered that he'd been attempting to milk a steer, a male animal, dry as a stone, with the sincere conviction that milk would eventually appear if he persisted long enough. No one laughed in front of him, but I imagine the effort it took to keep straight faces was considerable, and then there was the poetry. One evening by the fire, Price announced that he had written some verses and would like to share them. This was received with the polite attention that frontier manners required, and he proceeded to recite with feeling several stanzas of considerable beauty and power. Isabella listened with growing surprise. The language was far better than anything she would have expected from him, the imagery striking, the rhythm assured. It was, she thought, really very good. And then, halfway through the second piece, she recognised it. The verses were not Price's, they were Milton's. He had copied them out and was presenting them, with a completely straight face, as his own original composition. I'm not sure what to make of that, honestly. Part of me wants to be outraged. The man was a fraud, a cake thief, and an incompetent dairy operative. But another part of me finds something almost endearing about it, in a sad, awkward way. Here was a young man sent to the edge of the world to earn his keep by doing work he was hopelessly unsuited for, eating food he hadn't earned, trying desperately to impress people who saw through him instantly. He wasn't malicious, he was just lost. He'd washed up in a place where the only currency was competence, and he had none, and so he borrowed someone else's poetry and hoped no one would notice. Isabella noticed. Of course she did, but she didn't say anything, not to his face. She just wrote it down, in that quiet, precise way of hers, and let the absurdity of it speak for itself. The cabin was fuller with Price in it, and louder, and less peaceful. The rations went faster. The firewood went faster. The small, carefully maintained courtesies between the original three were disrupted by someone who didn't understand the rhythm and couldn't find his place in it. And yet, and this is what I keep coming back to, they accommodated him. They made room. They didn't throw him out or send him back down the mountain, though they would have been within their rights to do so. They fed him, shared the fire with him, let him warm himself at the stove he hadn't earned the right to sit beside, and went on with their winter. I think that tells you something about the kind of people they were, about what isolation does maybe, how it strips away the small, petty impulses and leaves behind something more basic and more generous. When there are only 4 people in a valley and the snow is deep and the nights are long, you don't turn someone away. You can't. Not because it would be wrong, though it would be, but because in that kind of cold, in that kind of silence, every human presence matters. Even the annoying ones. Even the ones who eat your cake at midnight and recite stolen poetry by the fire. Even they are warm bodies in a cold room and voices in the dark, and proof that the world outside the valley still exists somewhere, and that someone in it cared enough to send this hopeless young man up the mountain to work for his dinner. The 4 of them went on. The fire burned, the bread was made, the days passed, one into the next, unmarked and uncounted, held together by nothing but routine and patience and the slow, deepening cold. The trail into Estes Park came up through a narrow canyon, a deep cut in the rock walled on both sides by dark granite and dense pines, with a stream running fast and cold along the bottom. It was the only way in and the only way out, and at the mouth of this canyon, where the walls were steepest and the pines pressed closest together, there was a small log cabin set back from the trail in a clearing so tight the trees seemed to be leaning in around it. Smoke came from the chimney most days, and a dog, a big, shaggy, amber-eyed animal, lay on the porch with its head on its paws, watching the trail. This was where Arthur Dowell lived, and the cabin told you a great deal about the man before you ever met him. It was less a home than a den. The single room was dark and close, lit by a window so small it let in more shadow than light, and every surface was covered with something. Animal skins, piled and folded and tacked to the walls, some cured and soft, others stiff and unsorted. Antlers hung from the rafters. Bones of various sizes and origins lay in the corners. Traps and coils of wire occupied one end of the floor. A saddle, old and creased with use, sat on a wooden frame beside the door, and the air smelled of smoke and tallow and the particular sharp, wild scent of uncured hide. And scattered among all this, incongruously, almost shockingly, were stacks of old magazines and newspapers, months and sometimes years out of date, hauled up from the settlements on the plains by whoever happened to be passing through. He read them all. He read everything. On the one rough shelf that served as both pantry and library, a jar of dried venison sat beside a volume of poetry, and neither looked more at home than the other. A tin cup and a blackened coffee pot completed the inventory. It was the home of a man who needed very little and wanted even less, or who had trained himself over years of solitude to stop wanting. The dog's name was Flint. He was a large, loyal, rough-coated animal who never left Dowell's side and who watched his master with an attention so steady and so constant that it seemed less like the devotion of a pet than the vigilance of a guardian. When Dowell sat, Flint lay at his feet. When Dowell stood, Flint stood. When Dowell rode out into the canyon, Flint trotted alongside, and if the horse went too fast for him he'd fall behind but never give up. And when they stopped, he'd come panting up a few minutes later and collapse against Dowell's leg with a look of tired satisfaction. Isabella once wrote that Flint's eyes followed Dowell's every movement with an expression she could only describe as love, and that the feeling was unmistakably mutual. Whatever else could be said about this man, and a great deal could be said. He was kind to his dog, and his dog adored him, and in a life as solitary and as rough as the one he'd chosen, that small, warm, uncomplicated bond may have been the thing that kept him tethered to the human world. Arthur Dowell was by any measure an unusual man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had once been considered handsome, the kind of man whose appearance in a room would make people look up, but something had happened to him. Years before Isabella arrived in the valley, he'd been attacked by a bear in the high country, a grizzly, enormous and sudden, and the encounter had left him marked. One side of his face was scarred, and he'd lost the sight of one eye. The injuries had healed after a fashion, but they'd changed him in ways that went beyond the physical. He wore his golden hair long, past his shoulders, and his one good eye, bright, restless, startlingly intelligent, had a way of fixing on you that was both compelling and slightly unsettling. He dressed in buckskin, most of it patched and weather-beaten, and he carried a revolver the way most men carried a handkerchief, casually, always, as though it were simply part of getting dressed. What you noticed first, though, was his voice. He spoke beautifully. Not in the rough, practical idiom of the frontier, and not in the clipped, careful English of the educated classes, but in something that drew from both, a rich, flowing, unpredictable speech that could move in a single sentence from the plainest frontier slang to a phrase so precise and so musical that you'd stop and wonder where he'd learned it. He'd had an education. His father, people said, had been a military officer in the British Army, and the boy had been raised with books and languages and expectations that had nothing to do with trapping beaver in the Rocky Mountains. How he'd ended up here, alone, in a cabin at the mouth of a canyon, with a dog and a pile of animal skins and a past that no one in the valley talked about directly, was a question that had no simple answer. There had been trouble. That much was understood. The The kind of trouble that sends a man to the far edge of the world and makes him stay there. People in the valley spoke of it the way they spoke of bad weather, as something that had happened that was real, that you acknowledged without dwelling on. Isabella heard pieces of the story from different people, and what she gathered was that Dowell had once been a man of considerable promise, and that something, drink, violence, grief, some combination of all three, had taken that promise and broken it, and that the canyon where he lived was the place where the broken pieces had come to rest. She didn't press for details. The frontier had its own code about these things, and the code said you took a man as you found him, in the present moment, without interrogating his past. What mattered was what he did today. And today, what Arthur Dowell did was tend his beaver dams. He had several colonies of beaver under his protection, families of them, living in the streams and ponds that fed into the Big Thompson, building their lodges and their dams with a skill and a patience that fascinated him. He considered himself their guardian, and he took the role seriously. No one was allowed to trap on his stretch of water. No one was allowed to disturb the dams or the lodges or the animals themselves. He patrolled his territory regularly, riding slowly along the streams with Flint at his side, checking the dams for damage, watching for signs of predators, and occasionally repairing a breach in the stonework with his own hands, working alongside the beavers as if they were his colleagues rather than his charges. One afternoon, when the weather was clear and the wind had dropped to nothing, he took Isabella to see them. They rode together through Black Canyon, the deepest and narrowest part of the gorge, where the rock walls rose 500 feet on either side, and the sunlight reached the bottom for only a few hours a day. The canyon floor was dark and cool and smelled of wet stone and pine resin, and the cold mineral scent of the stream running through it. Ferns grew in the crevices. Mosses covered the rocks in thick green cushions. The light that filtered down from above was greenish and watery, the light of a cathedral, and the sound of the stream echoed off the walls and came back to you, multiplied and softened as if the canyon itself were humming. The beaver dam was at a bend in the stream where the water widened into a shallow pond. It was a remarkable piece of engineering, a wall of interlocked branches, mud and stones, several feet high and 15 or 20 feet across, holding back the water so perfectly that the pond behind it was smooth and still while the stream below tumbled away over rocks. The beavers had built it by gnawing through whole aspens and cottonwoods. You could see the stumps along the bank, each one tapered to a neat point by the rodents' chisel-like teeth, and dragging the logs to the dam site, where they were woven together with smaller branches and packed tight with mud carried in their paws. The mud was applied with the flat of the tail, which the beaver used like a trowel, patting and smoothing until the surface was watertight. On the upstream side of the dam, just below the waterline, was the entrance to the lodge, a mound of sticks and mud rising like a small island from the pond, inside which the beaver family lived in a dry, dark, insulated chamber that stayed above freezing even in the coldest weather. Isabella watched them work as the sun moved down the canyon wall. They came out in the late afternoon, swimming low in the water with just their heads visible, trailing V-shaped wakes across the glassy surface of the pond. They were larger than she'd expected. A full-grown beaver could weigh 50 pounds or more, and their movements in the water were smooth and unhurried, with a competence that reminded her, she said, of Frederick Colville. They dove and resurfaced, carrying branches in their teeth. They climbed out onto the dam and patted mud into cracks with quick, precise movements of their forepaws. One large female worked the same section of dam for 20 minutes without stopping, pressing mud into a gap, smoothing it flat, testing it with her nose, then going back for more. And all of it was done in near silence. No calls, no signals that she could hear, just the soft splash of entry and exit, and the occasional sharp slap of a flat tail on the water, which was, Dowell explained, a warning to the others that something was watching. When that slap came, every beaver in the pond vanished. One moment the surface was alive with dark heads and spreading ripples. The next it was flat and empty, as if they'd never been there at all. You'd wait, holding very still, and after 5 minutes or 10, a nose would reappear, cautiously, at the far end of the pond, testing the air. Then another, and slowly, one by one, they'd come back and the work would resume. I keep thinking about those beavers, the way they built and stored and planned. They'd cut down trees in autumn and sink the branches in the pond near the lodge, anchoring them to the bottom with stones, so that when the pond froze over in winter, they'd have an underwater pantry of fresh bark to feed on without ever having to venture onto the ice. Every piece of their engineering was designed around one problem: how to survive the winter. And they'd been solving that problem for millions of years, long before any human being had ever set foot in these mountains, building their dams and their lodges and their underwater stores with a patience that made human effort look hasty and improvised. Dowell knew this, and you could tell it moved him. The idea that these animals, these small, flat-tailed, buck-toothed engineers, had figured out something about persistence and preparation that most people never would. He came to the main cabin sometimes in the evenings, not often and never predictably. You couldn't count on him the way you could count on the fire being lit or the bread being ready. He appeared when he appeared, and you took him as he came. On his good days he was extraordinary company. He'd sit by the fire with Flint at his feet and talk for hours, about the mountains, about the animals, about the history of the frontier and the people who'd passed through it, about the Ute and the Arapaho and their ways of reading weather and tracking game, about books he'd read years ago in a life that seemed to belong to a different person entirely. His memory was astonishing. He could recite long passages of poetry from memory, Shakespeare, Byron, Burns, and he did so not showily but quietly, the way Ashworth read aloud, letting the words fall into the room like stones dropped into still water. He had opinions about everything: politics, religion, art, the character of the president, the proper way to skin an elk, and he expressed them with an eloquence that was startling coming from a man in patched buckskin who smelled of campfire and animal fat and who hadn't seen a town in months. Isabella found herself drawn to him in a way she couldn't entirely explain and wasn't entirely comfortable with. He was brilliant, he was charming, he was also, she knew, dangerous. Not to her, not directly, but in the way that a man who has lost control of his own life is always dangerous, because you never know which version of him you're going to get. On his dark days, he was different. He'd come to the cabin and sit in the corner without speaking, his one good eye fixed on the fire, his hand resting on Flint's head, and you could feel the weight of whatever he was carrying pressing down on the room like weather. No one tried to draw him out on those days. No one asked what was wrong. They simply let him be, and after an hour or two he'd stand up and nod and walk back down the trail to his cabin in the canyon, and the room would feel lighter after he'd gone. Not because they were glad to see him leave, but because the particular kind of sorrow he carried was so heavy that even sharing space with it was tiring. There's a kind of person who belongs to the wilderness not because they chose it, but because they couldn't survive anywhere else. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The rules of ordinary life, the compromises, the courtesies, the small daily negotiations that make society possible, are too much for them, too tight, too false. They need a place where the only rules are the ones the weather makes, and the only company is the kind that doesn't judge. Dowell was that kind of person. The canyon was his place, the beaver dams were his work, Flint was his companion, and the mountains, enormous and indifferent and endlessly, unbearably beautiful, were the only walls he could tolerate around him. I think Isabella understood this about him, even if she never quite said it. She recognized something in his restlessness, his inability to stay still, his need for open space and clean air and the sound of running water, because she had it too, in a milder form. She'd left England because the drawing rooms were too small. She'd crossed oceans and continents because the familiar world felt like a cage. She knew what it was to need more sky than other people needed. And in Dowell she saw that need taken to its furthest, most extreme, most destructive conclusion. A man who needed so much sky that he'd burn down everything else to get it. The last time she saw him that winter, he was standing at the edge of the trail where the canyon opened into the park, Flint beside him, both of them silhouetted against the late afternoon light. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the canyon walls had turned that deep bruised purple that only happens in the last 10 minutes before the light is gone entirely. The pines on the ridge were black against a sky that was still faintly gold. Somewhere behind him, in the darkness of the gorge, the stream was running and the beavers were working and the cold was settling in for the night. He raised one hand, not waving exactly, just acknowledging, and she raised hers, and then the trail curved and the pines closed in, and he was gone. Just a man and a dog, standing at the entrance to a canyon, with the dark coming on and the mountains rising behind them into a sky that was losing its last colour. She never forgot it. Neither, I think, will I. The supplies were going, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the slow, steady, irreversible way that a candle burns down. You'd glance at the shelf one morning and notice that the flour sack was thinner than it had been last week, that the tin of coffee had a hollow sound when you shook it, that the sugar bowl was empty and had been empty for 3 days, and no one had said anything about it because there was nothing to say. The nearest store was in Longmount, 30 miles away and a full day's ride in good weather, and this was not good weather. The trail down the canyon was buried under snow, and even if someone had been willing to attempt it, there was no guarantee they'd make it through and no guarantee they'd make it back. So the pantry shrank, and they watched it shrink and they adjusted. The tea went first. Isabella, who was English to her bones and who had been drinking tea since childhood, felt this loss with a particular keenness. Tea was not a luxury to her. It was architecture, the frame around which a day was built. Morning tea, afternoon tea, evening tea. Without it, the hours lost their shape and the meals, already plain and repetitive, became bleaker. They stretched what was left by reusing the leaves, steeping them twice and then 3 times, until what came out of the pot was barely coloured water with a ghost of flavour. Then the leaves ran out entirely, and there was nothing left but coffee, and the coffee was going too, and she knew that within a week or 2 they'd be drinking hot water with milk and calling it a beverage. The sugar had been gone for a while. The dried fruit, raisins, a few wizened apples someone had brought up in autumn, was finished. The butter was down to a thin scraping in the bottom of the crock, and Isabella had taken to cutting it with a warm knife to make it spread further. The molasses jar, which had once been full enough to flavour a dozen puddings, was nearly empty, and what remained had crystallised into a dark, sticky mass at the bottom that you had to chip out with a knife. Salt was low, baking soda was nearly gone. The flour, which was the most critical item of all because without flour there was no bread, was dropping steadily, and Colville had begun measuring it out by the cupful each morning with the careful attention of a man rationing ammunition. He kept the sack tied shut between uses and stored it on the highest shelf, where the mice couldn't reach it and where Price, whose midnight raids on the pantry were now a known hazard, would have to make enough noise climbing up to wake someone. They decided to cut back to 2 meals instead of 3. This seemed logical, less food consumed, supplies lasting longer, simple arithmetic. But the human body doesn't work by arithmetic. What happened instead was that they arrived at each of the 2 remaining meals hungrier than they'd ever been at 3, and they ate more at each sitting, so that the total consumption barely changed, and the only real effect was that they spent more of the day thinking about food. The altitude made it worse. At 7,500 feet, the body burns fuel faster just to stay warm, and the cold, which was now deep and constant, never above freezing even in the middle of the day, turned every calorie into a small, urgent necessity. They were hungry all the time. Not starving, not in any danger, but hungry in the nagging, persistent way that makes you dream about bread and wake up with your mouth watering. I think about what that does to you. The slow arithmetic of scarcity. How it changes the way you look at a plate of food. When the pantry is full, a meal is just a meal. You eat it. You push back from the table, you move on. But when the pantry is shrinking and no one knows when it'll be filled again, every meal becomes a small event, weighted with gratitude and anxiety in equal measure. You're grateful for what's in front of you. You're anxious about what won't be there tomorrow. And between those 2 feelings, stretched thin as wire, is the strange, heightened awareness that comes from living close to the edge of enough. The feeling that food is not just nourishment, but meaning. Not just fuel, but proof that the world is still providing, still holding you, still offering something warm when the cold presses in. The lake, at least, still had fish. Under its frozen surface the trout were there, cold-blooded, slow-moving in the near-freezing water, but alive and catchable. Getting to them required a process that had its own rough poetry. First you chose your spot, a place where the ice was thick enough to stand on but not so thick that chopping through it would take all morning. Then you swung the axe. The first blow rang out across the valley like a bell, sharp and clean in the frozen air, and chips of white ice flew up around your boots. You'd chop in a circle, widening the hole stroke by stroke until the dark water appeared beneath. Black at first, then clearing as the disturbed ice settled until you could see down into the lake as if through a window, and what you saw was extraordinary. The water below was clear and still, lit by the sunlight coming through the ice above, and in that cold, greenish light the trout hung suspended, silver-sided, spotted with crimson, their tails moving with a slow, dreamy rhythm as if they were breathing rather than swimming. They were beautiful. Isabella knelt on the ice and looked down through the hole and watched them for a long time before anyone thought to lower a line. There was something hypnotic about it. These bright living things, moving in their own quiet world just a few feet below the frozen surface she was kneeling on, entirely unaware of her, entirely absorbed in their own slow business. The ice was a boundary between two worlds, and through the hole you could see from one into the other, and the other was calm and graceful and untouched by the wind and the cold that made the upper world so harsh. They caught them by hook with whatever bait could be found, scraps of meat, small pieces of fat, once a bit of red cloth that the trout seemed to mistake for something alive, and pulled them up through the hole one at a time, flopping and gasping on the white ice, their colours brilliant against the snow. The crimson spots on their sides, which underwater had looked soft and muted, blazed in the sunlight like tiny drops of paint. Their scales caught the light and threw it back in flickers of silver and green. They were wild fish, lean and muscular from the cold water and the fast current, and their flesh, when cooked, was white and firm and clean-tasting in a way that no market fish could match. On a good day they'd catch a dozen or more, enough to feed everyone for 2 full meals, and Colville would fry them quickly, deftly, the way only he could, and they'd eat them hot and crackling from the pan, picking the flesh off the fine bones with their fingers, licking the grease from their palms, savouring every bite in the way you only do when food has become precious. And then, somewhere in the middle of all this careful rationing and quiet hunger, Thanksgiving arrived. Isabella had been planning for it. Not openly, not with announcements or menus or any of the ritual preparation that the holiday would have required in an English household, but quietly, privately, saving things. For days before the date she'd been setting aside what she could: a few eggs, kept from freezing by tucking them close to the stove, a portion of cream skimmed from the top of the milk pail before anyone else could pour it into their coffee, a careful measure of flour taken from the dwindling sack and hidden in a separate tin. She'd found a small cache of molasses at the very bottom of the jar, enough for flavouring. She'd dried cherries, a handful, perhaps 2, saved from a batch that someone had brought up the mountain weeks earlier, and she had a plan. The morning of Thanksgiving she took over the kitchen. This was unusual. Colville normally cooked, and he was better at it, and everyone knew it. But this was her project, and the men, sensing something in her quiet determination, stepped aside and let her work. She lit the stove early, built the fire up until the oven was radiating that deep, steady heat you need for baking, and began. She made a pudding first, a proper boiled pudding, the kind her mother might have made in the rectory kitchen in England, with flour and eggs and cream and the last of the molasses stirred in for sweetness and colour. She mixed it in the big brass pan, beat it with a fork until her arm ached, and the batter was smooth and heavy, poured it into a floured cloth, tied the cloth tightly at the top, leaving room for the pudding to swell, and lowered it into a pot of boiling water on the back of the stove. It would need hours, and she'd have to keep the water at a steady boil the whole time, feeding the stove regularly, adding water from the kettle as the level dropped. While the pudding steamed, she made a custard sauce to go with it, eggs and cream and a scraping of sugar from somewhere, heated slowly in a tin set inside a larger tin of hot water, stirred and stirred and stirred until it thickened into something smooth and golden that coated the back of the spoon. She made a rolled pastry with the dried cherries inside, crimped the edges shut with her fingers, and set it in the oven on the one good baking sheet they had. And she made a gingerbread, a large, dense, spiced loaf that used the last of a jar of ground ginger she'd found at the back of the shelf, pressed into a pan and baked until the kitchen filled with a smell so warm and so familiar, and so achingly reminiscent of ordinary, comfortable, faraway life that for a moment the cabin in the Rocky Mountains could have been anywhere. Could have been a farmhouse in Yorkshire, a vicarage in Hampshire, any warm kitchen in any cold country where someone was baking something sweet because the day demanded it. Colville, meanwhile, had been out hunting since dawn. He came back in the early afternoon with venison, fresh, not dried, from a deer he'd found in the lower meadow, and he butchered it and cut the steaks thick and set them sizzling in the iron pan with the last knob of butter. The potatoes were boiled, plain and simple, the way they always were. The coffee was made strong, using a full measure of grounds instead of the half measure they'd been rationing themselves to. And when everything was ready, the venison steaks brown and crackling, the potatoes steaming, the pudding turned out of its cloth onto a plate, the custard poured into a jug, the gingerbread sliced and golden, the cherry roll still warm from the oven, they sat down. There were 4 of them at the table: Isabella, Ashworth, Colville, and Price. The fire in the chimney was burning high, the cabin was warm, outside the sun was going down behind the white peaks, and the temperature was dropping towards 0, and the wolves would be starting to stir on the ridges, and the ice on the lake was thickening minute by minute. But inside, for this one evening, there was enough. More than enough. There was abundance. They ate slowly. Not because they were being polite, though they were, but because they wanted it to last. They knew, all of them knew, without saying it, that this was the best meal they'd have for a long time. Possibly the best meal until someone rode down to the plains and came back with supplies, and that might not happen for weeks. So they ate the venison slowly and savoured the potatoes, and when the pudding came out, dark and rich and steaming with the golden custard poured over it, there was a silence at the table that was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who are tasting something and finding it extraordinary. Isabella had done it. With almost nothing, a handful of flour, a few saved eggs, the dregs of a molasses jar, a clutch of dried cherries, the memory of how her mother used to cook, she'd made a feast. Not a grand feast, not the kind you'd read about in a novel, with crystal glasses and silver platters, and a roast the size of a small child. A small feast. A human feast. The kind that matters most precisely because it's made from what's left when almost everything is gone. You know what stays with me about that evening? It's not the food, though the food was clearly wonderful. It's the fact that she planned it. She thought about it days in advance. She saved ingredients one by one, hiding them from the general supply, not out of selfishness, but out of a kind of stubborn, beautiful insistence that even in the middle of a Rocky Mountain winter, even with the flour running low and the sugar gone and the trail snowed shut, there would be a Thanksgiving. There would be a day that was different from the other days. There would be a meal that meant something beyond calories and warmth. She could have let the day pass unmarked. No one would have minded. No one would have known. But she knew, and she couldn't let it go. I think that's one of the most human things a person can do. To insist on celebration when circumstances argue against it. To say, no, today's not the same as yesterday. Today we stop and notice. Today we're grateful. Not because things are easy. Not because there's plenty. But because there isn't plenty and we're still here and the fire is burning and the bread is warm, and for this one evening in this one cabin, at the foot of this one mountain, that is enough. After supper they sat by the fire, fuller than they'd been in weeks, warm and drowsy and oddly tender with each other. The satisfaction of a good meal, a real meal, one that had been planned and prepared and served with care, had softened something in each of them. Someone played the harmonium. Soft, slow hymns. Nothing fast or complicated, just the kind of music that settles over a room like a blanket and asks nothing in return. The notes from the small organ were reedy and thin, pushed out by the hand-pumped bellows, but in that cabin, on that night, they sounded as rich and as full as anything in a cathedral. Isabella mended something. She always mended something. Ashworth read, his book held close to the firelight, turning the pages slowly. Colville cleaned his rifle with that slow, absorbed attention of his, the oiled cloth moving back and forth along the barrel in a rhythm that was almost musical. Even Price was quiet for once, sitting with his hands folded and his eyes half closed, looking, for the first and perhaps only time that winter, like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. The fire burned low. The cabin cooled. One by one they drifted towards sleep. Real sleep. The deep kind. The kind that comes from a full stomach and a warm room and the simple, animal satisfaction of having eaten well. Outside, the stars were sharp and the cold was deepening and the valley was white and still. The pudding plate sat on the table, empty, scraped clean. The gingerbread was gone. The cherry roll was gone. Tomorrow they'd be back to venison and potatoes and rationed coffee, and the day after that and the day after that. But tonight had been different. Tonight there had been enough. There were no letters. That fact seems small when you say it quickly, but it wasn't small. It was enormous. In 1873, letters were the only thread that connected a person in the Rocky Mountains to anything beyond the nearest ridge. There was no telegraph in Estes Park, no post office, no regular courier. If someone happened to be riding down to the plains, they might take a bundle of letters with them and post them in Longmount, and if someone happened to be riding up, they might bring a bundle back. But in winter, when the trail was buried and the canyon was treacherous and no one was riding anywhere unless they had to, the letters simply stopped. For weeks at a time, Isabella had no news of her family in England, no news of the country she'd left, no news of anything beyond the valley. The world outside might have burned down or been rebuilt or stayed exactly the same, and she wouldn't have known. She had no newspaper. She had no book except the one she'd brought, her Thomas à Kempis, worn and familiar, its pages softened by handling, its margins marked with faint pencil notes in her small, careful handwriting. She had no calendar, no clock that kept reliable time, no schedule that wasn't dictated by the sun and the stove and the stomach. The days came and went without names. The weeks passed without markers. Christmas, she realised with a start one morning, might have already come and gone without anyone noticing. And in that absence, that vast, peaceful, slightly frightening absence of information and structure, something happened that she hadn't expected. Her attention, which in ordinary life was scattered across 1,000 small demands and obligations and distractions, narrowed. It focused. It settled, like sediment in a still glass of water, on the things that were directly in front of her. The fire, the food, the weather, the mountains, the faces of the people she lived with. And it stayed there, with a steadiness and a depth that she'd never experienced before, and that she suspected she might never experience again. I think most of us have no idea how much of our attention is consumed by information we don't need. The news, the opinions, the endless small updates about things that don't affect us and that we can't affect. It's like a noise, a constant low-level hum that we've become so accustomed to that we don't hear it anymore, and we only notice its absence when it stops. For Isabella, it stopped, and what was left when the noise was gone was the world itself, the actual physical present world, with its cold and its light and its silence, asking nothing of her but that she look at it. And she looked. She looked with an attention that borders on devotion, and what she saw was this: beauty. Not the comfortable, pretty beauty of a garden or a painting or a view, from a window that you've learned to admire because someone told you it was admirable. Not the kind of beauty you'd frame and hang on a wall, but a harder, stranger, more demanding beauty. The beauty of a landscape that doesn't care whether you're watching it or not, that would be exactly as magnificent if no human being had ever seen it, and that offers no warmth, no comfort, no reassurance, just scale and light and the slow turning of the seasons across stone. Every evening the mountains perform the same act. As the sun dropped behind the western ridge, the peaks on the far side of the valley would catch the light and begin to change colour, slowly at first, then faster, then all at once. The granite, which during the day was a flat, pale grey, would turn gold, then amber, then a deep, burning rose that crept upward from the tree line to the summit and held there for a few minutes as if the rock itself were on fire. The lesser peaks went through the same sequence but faster, losing their colour almost as soon as they caught it, yielding the light upward and upward to the tallest summits. Long's Peak was always the last to catch the light and the last to let it go, and on clear evenings its splintered summit would blaze against the sky, in a colour that Isabella struggled to name. Not red exactly, not orange, but something between the two, something fierce and cold and utterly without tenderness. On the nights when the light was strongest, the peak seemed to glow from within, as if some immense furnace were burning behind the rock, and the snow on its flanks would turn a lurid, smouldering crimson that looked more like volcanic fire than sunset. She called it an unearthly beauty. She called it loveless, and she watched it every evening without fail, standing at the door of the main cabin with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders and the cold biting at her face, because she couldn't bear to miss it. Then the colour would die. It happened quickly, a minute, perhaps two, and the peak would go from blazing rose to ash grey to a kind of dead leaden blue, and the sky behind it would darken from gold to violet, to the deep, almost black blue of a mountain night. And that was it. The show was over, it would happen again tomorrow, and the day after that, with variations so subtle, a difference in the clouds, a shift in the angle of the light, a slightly different shade of pink, that only someone watching very carefully would notice them. Isabella noticed them. She noticed everything. There's something about seeing the same beautiful thing every day that changes your relationship with it. The first time you see a sunset over Long's Peak, it's spectacle. You gasp, you point, you try to photograph it with your eyes. The 10th time, you're quieter. You've started to understand the pattern, the way the colours move, the sequence of changes. The 50th time, you don't gasp at all. You just stand there watching, and the beauty goes in deeper than spectacle ever could. It bypasses the part of you that's impressed and reaches the part of you that's still. This is what repetition does to wonder. It doesn't diminish it, it distills it. It turns the big, loud, obvious beauty of the first encounter into something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more personal. It becomes yours, not because you own it, but because you've watched it so many times that it's become part of how you see. The mountain doesn't change. You change. One night the aurora came. Isabella had seen the northern lights before. Faint greenish curtains over the English countryside, barely visible through the haze of a lowland sky. But nothing like this. Nothing like this, at all. The display began after midnight, when the sky over the northern ridge suddenly brightened, as if someone had lit an enormous fire behind the mountains. Then the colours appeared. Green first, a pale, wavering, ghostly green that spread upward from the horizon, like smoke rising from a cold fire. It pulsed, it flickered, it moved in curtains and sheets that folded and unfolded against the dark sky with a slow, silent, dreamlike rhythm, as if something immense were breathing just beyond the edge of sight. Then red, deep and rich, and utterly unlike any red she'd seen in nature. Not the red of fire or blood or sunset, but a cold red, a red that belonged to the upper atmosphere and to nothing earthly, pulsing in slow waves across the sky as if the air itself were alive. Then white, a fierce, bright, almost violent white that shot upward in columns and shafts and rays, flickering and shifting and rearranging itself with a speed and a restlessness that made the stars around it look frozen and dull by comparison. A great double ring formed around the moon, and inside the ring the colours swirled and mixed and separated, and the whole sky from horizon to horizon was alive. The peaks reflected the light, green on their snowy flanks, then red, then white, and the lake reflected the peaks, so that the valley was filled with moving colour, above and below, with no horizon and no separation between the sky and its image. It lasted for hours. Isabella sat on the porch of the main cabin, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and watched it in silence, and no one else woke up, and the beauty was hers alone. I don't know what she thought about during those hours. The source material doesn't say, but I imagine she thought about the strangeness of being here. An Englishwoman, a clergyman's daughter, alone on a porch in the Rocky Mountains at 2 a.m, watching the sky burn with colours that had no name and no explanation, while the valley slept around her, and the wolves called on the ridge, and the pole star, steady as always, held its position directly above her cabin door. I imagine she thought about how far she'd come, not just in miles, but in the distance between who she'd been in England and who she was now. The woman who'd left England couldn't have survived a single night in this cabin. The woman who sat on this porch had been surviving for months, and more than surviving. She'd been learning slowly and without quite realising it, that the life she'd built here, out of almost nothing, was the most real life she'd ever lived. The mornings were their own kind of miracle. She'd written about them earlier in her stay, the purple-grey stillness of the lake before dawn, the way the peaks appeared first in the reflection and then in the sky, the spreading colour. But as the weeks passed, the miracle didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. She noticed things she hadn't noticed before, the way the frost on the grass caught the first light and turned the meadow into a field of tiny prisms, each blade holding a small, perfect spectrum. The way the steam from the stream, the one open channel in the ice, rose in the cold air and caught the sunrise and turned gold, so that for a few minutes the water seemed to be breathing out light. The way the mountains appeared in stages, the nearest ones first, then the middle distance, then the far ranges, each one stepping forward out of the darkness like actors coming on stage until the whole immense circle of peaks was visible, and the valley sat inside them like a jewel in a setting. She called it the daily miracle, and the word daily is as important as the word miracle. It happened every morning, every single morning without fail, without exception, whether anyone was watching or not, Whether the cabin was full of people or empty, whether the world beyond the mountains was at war or at peace, the sun came up, the light moved down the mountains, the frost glittered and then melted, the lake turned from grey to blue. And this had been happening, she realised, for tens of thousands of years. Long before anyone built a cabin here, long before anyone gave these mountains names, long before there was an England to leave or a reason to leave it. The beauty was not for her. It was not for anyone. It simply was. And the fact that she happened to be here, at this moment, in this particular autumn and winter of 1873 to see it, that was the miracle. Not the sunrise, the seeing. The walk back to her cabin each night became a kind of ritual, the last act of each day, performed in solitude, in cold, in silence. She'd leave the main cabin after the fire had burned low, and the conversation had faded, and the harmonium had fallen silent, and she'd step out into the cold. The cold would hit her immediately, a physical thing, a wall of it, pressing against her face and her hands and finding its way through her thin clothes within seconds. The transition was always a shock, no matter how many times she'd done it, from the warm, smoky, lamplit room full of voices to this vast, silent, frozen darkness that stretched in every direction without end. She'd pull her shawl tighter and start walking across the frosted grass toward the lake, and the sound of her boots would be the loudest thing in the valley. Crunch, 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 each step breaking through the brittle crust of the frost, each step leaving a dark print on the white ground behind her. Sometimes she carried a heated stone wrapped in cloth to warm her bed. Sometimes she carried nothing but herself. Overhead the stars would be enormous, not just visible but present, as if they'd moved closer during the night, as if the cold had contracted the air and brought them nearer. The Milky Way was not a faint smear, but a blazing road, dense with light, arching over the valley from one ridge to the other. And the pole star, as always, hung directly over her door. She'd reach her cabin. She'd push the swollen door open with her shoulder, the wood scraping against the frame. She'd step inside into the darker dark and feel along the shelf for the matches, and strike one and light her fat and rag lamp, and the small yellow flame would push the shadows back just enough to see by. The room would be cold. It was always cold when she'd been away, cold as the outside, cold as the ground beneath it. And her breath would hang in the air in front of her face. She'd pile blankets on her bed. She'd pull them up over her head, all of them, layer upon layer, until the cold began to ease and the warmth of her own body started to gather under the covers. She'd hear the skunk stirring beneath the floor, that familiar, almost companionable shuffling, and the wind in the pines and the wolves, and sometimes, if the night was very still, the faint distant crack of ice expanding on the lake. A sound like a gunshot heard from miles away, sharp and sudden, and then gone. And she'd think, I know she thought this because she wrote it, she'd think that this strange, cold, beautiful, impossible life was the best life she'd ever known. That here, in a cabin with no lock and no mirror and no letter from home, she was more herself than she'd ever been anywhere else. That the mountains and the cold and the silence had stripped away everything that wasn't essential, and left behind only what was real. And what was real was this: a woman, a fire, a sky full of stars, and the slow, ancient turning of the light. She knew it couldn't last. Winter would break. The trail would open. Someone would ride up from Longmount carrying letters and news and the pull of the world she'd left behind, and she'd have to go. She couldn't stay forever in a valley with no society, no income, no future. She was a Victorian woman, and the world had expectations of her, and sooner or later those expectations would reach even this far. She'd ride back down the canyon, she'd come up past Dowell's cabin, past the beaver dams, down through the dark gap in the rock and out onto the plains, and the valley would close behind her the way a book closes when you finish the last page. Other people would come, other winters would pass, the stove would go on being fed, the bread would go on being made, but she wouldn't be there to see the sunrise hit the lake, and the mountains would go on turning rose and ash and blue without her watching, and the pole star would shine above an empty cabin door. But for now, for these weeks, these slow and precious weeks, none of that mattered. The world could wait. The letters could wait. Everything could wait. There was only the valley and the cold and the fire and the light on the mountains each morning, faithful as a promise, the daily miracle repeating itself, asking nothing, offering everything, and she was there to see it. She left eventually. The trail opened and a horse was saddled, and she rode back down the canyon and out onto the plains and into the rest of her life. She went on to write about it, all of it, the cabin and the cold and the stove and the bread and the skunk and the sunrise, in letters that became a book, and the book was read by thousands, and Estes Park became a place that other people visited and then lived in, and then built roads to, and then named a national park after. The cabin is gone now, the valley is different, but the mountains are the same, and Long's Peak still catches the last light every evening, and the pole star still hangs over the place where Isabella's door used to be. I keep thinking about the people we passed through this story with tonight. Henry Ashmore laughing in his doorway, generous to a fault. Oliver Ashworth carrying water with damaged lungs and never once complaining. Frederick Colville splitting wood and making bread with a quiet competence that asked for nothing in return. Even Edwin Price eating cake in the dark, reciting borrowed poetry, trying so hard to belong. And Arthur Dowell standing at the mouth of his canyon with Flint at his side, watching the light go out of the sky. These were real people. They lived and worked, and kept each other warm through a winter that most of us can barely imagine, and then they scattered, the way people do, back into the larger world, where their names grew faint and their faces were forgotten by everyone except the woman who'd shared their fire. But she remembered them. And now, tonight, for a little while, so do we. There's something in that worth holding on to. The idea that an ordinary winter, lived quietly by ordinary people in an extraordinary place, can still matter 150 years later. That the bread someone baked, and the fire someone tended, and the water someone carried through the snow are not small things. They never were. You're warm right now, wherever you are, in your bed, under your blankets, with the familiar sounds of your own home around you. You're warm and safe, and the cold outside, whatever cold there is, can't reach you. Isabella would have understood exactly how good that feels. She'd have envied you the lock on your door and the lamp by your bed, and the ease with which you can reach for a glass of water without first breaking through a layer of ice. And she might have told you, in that quiet way of hers, that warmth is never so sweet as when you've known what it is to go without it. If tonight's story brought you something, a picture, a feeling, a moment of stillness before sleep, I'd be glad to hear about it. A few words in the comments, whenever you like, about where you're listening from tonight or what stayed with you. There's no hurry, it can wait until morning. This channel is a slow thing and I'm glad of that. We'll go on telling stories like this one. Stories from the medieval world, from ancient Rome, from the kitchens and castles and quiet corners of history where people lived their lives without knowing that anyone would ever care to hear about them. Stories about bread and fire and cold and the small acts of courage that don't make it into the books. We're building this slowly, one evening at a time, and if you'd like to come along, to subscribe, to stay, to let another night like this one find you when you need it, you are warmly welcome. We'll be here. For now, let the story go, let the valley close, let the mountains fade to blue, the way they always do, and let the fire in the cabin burn down to its last quiet ember. Sleep well.